Okay, we'll get started. Good evening if you are in Shanghai. Good afternoon if you are in Abu Dhabi, and very early morning if you are in New York. My name is Tansen Sen. I'm the director of the Center for Global Asia. And welcome to the series of talks on the Mongols. This is being done because we are teaching a course on the Mongols in Shanghai, as well as in New York. This is the third of the series that we are doing this semester. And we are really very honored to have one of the leading scholars of the Mongols in the world, Professor Mikhail Biran. She has been an expert on the Mongols in Central Asia, writing perhaps the most important book on Kaitu. That was, I think, her first book. And she has written on a number of Eurasian-related histories of Mongols. I know currently she is working on the Cambridge history of the Mongols, but she is a professor, Max and Sophie Mendan's foundation professor in humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is, in addition to a leading scholar, I should point out, she is one of the builders of the Mongol studies, especially in Israel. Many of the people I know, many of the people who have spoken in this series actually have come from Israel or have experienced the Israeli way of looking at the Mongols because of Mikhail Biran. She had set up perhaps the leading institution to study Mongols. If any of you, I know there are many of my students here, if you are interested in studying more on the Mongols, you should go and study with her. She is going to talk about one of the important topics as we conclude our semester here on the Mongols and the imperial space, from universalism to glocalization. And I know many of you are reading Marco Polo in the audience, but she'll be talking about many interesting issues about the Mongols, looking at many of the broader issues of the Mongols. She will be speaking for about 40-45 minutes, after which we'll open up the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please write your questions in the box, and on your behalf, I'll be asking the questions to Mikhail Biran. Now, the video of today's talk will be available on our website. You are welcome to look at it again if you are interested in. After this talk, we'll have another talk next week on the Mongols. But now I'll invite Mikhail Biran. We can't bring her to China as of yet, but at some point, we hope she will come to Shanghai and meet with us in person. But for now, let's hear from Mikhail Biran about the Mongols from Jerusalem. Mikhail.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this generous introduction. Let me just try and share my screen. Just a minute, and then I can begin. Okay, so can you see and hear me? Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, okay, so welcome everybody. Now, my talk is based on my chapter in a volume that is due to be published by Cambridge University Press next month, called Limits of Universal Rule, Eurasian Empire Compared. And this is the first publication of an international project which I initiated with my friend and colleague Yuri Pines, a noted sinologist, and colleagues from Germany and Austria. And it seeks to systematically compare basic characteristics of Eurasian continental empires from the first millennium BCE and up to the 19th century. And for our first volume, we chose the spatial aspect of empires, about which I will speak today. And the question we set were the one you see here: what prompted or limited the imperial expansion? How were the territories under the empire's control incorporated? And how was the imperial space conceived by the rulers and the subject? And I'm going to speak today about the third, or actually part of the third part of the third questions. Although in the Q&A, I'd be happy to refer to the other questions as well. But first, let me set the stage. Also, I guess you all know it, but let's make a common ground. So in the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his heir created the largest continuous empire in world history, an empire that at its height stretched from Korea to Hungary and from Vietnam, Burma, and Iraq to Siberia, ruling over 2/3 of the old world. Only the British Empire in its height ruled over a larger imperial space. Moreover, as the only superpower of the era, the empire also affected regions beyond its control, such as Japan, Southeast Asia, India, the Arab Middle East, and Europe, both Eastern and Western, not least due to its contribution to the integration of the Eurasian steppe. In imperial terms, the Mongolian combined together territories which were formerly ruled by various Sunnitic Muslims, and before them Iranians, and the steppe empire, as well as territories, especially in the north, that were never formerly part of any imperial system. Now, Mongol imperial system was created by conquest. The empire existed in an ever-expanded unified policy ruled from Mongolia up to 1260, and later dissolved in a process that eventually resulted in the creation of 4 regional empires centered in China, Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, and the Volga region, each headed by a Genghis Branch. The state headed by the Great Khan or Khan Ulus in Mongolian, centered in China, it became known as the Yuan Dynasty and enjoyed a nominal, so not uncontested primacy over its counterparts. The Ilkhanate, or Hulegu Ulus in Mongolian, centered in Iran and Iraq, the Golden Horde centered in the Volga region, and the Chagatai Khanate or Chagatai Ulus held power in Central Asia. Now, despite the many and often bloody disputes between the 4 polities, they retained a strong sense of Genghisid unity. In the mid-14th century, all 4 Khanate became embroiled in political crisis that led to the collapse of the Ilkhanate and Yuan China and considerably weakened the 2-step Khanate. The fall of the Khan state in 1368 is generally deemed to be the end of the Mongol moment in world history. For convenience, I shall differentiate between 2 main periods, that of the United Mongol Empire, or the Yeke-Mongol Ulus in Mongolian, the great nation of the Mongols, and that of the 4 successor states or uluses. However, as I shall demonstrate below, from the Mongols' point of view, this division was not that clear-cut. Now, there are 3 questions that guide this talk. How did the Mongol conceive space? How did their concept affected their subject spatial concept? And how did the Mongol influence the future or the shaping of the future post-Mongol Eurasian space? Now, I stress the interplay between the Mongols' universal vision, their construction or creation of a Genghisid space, and the revival of glocal spatial concept in Mongol rule, China and Iran. Now, the modern concept of glocalization, a combination of global and local, referring to the simultaneous occurrence of both universalizing and particularizing tendencies in social, political, and economical system, may seem a bit anachronistic when used in relation to the Mongol period. However, I chose to use it because it captures nicely the need of the Mongols and their local elite to combine the highly universal world order of the Genghisid with the local concept of the sedentary subject, thereby creating a new and revived spatial concept which had a tremendous effect on the post-Mongol world. Now, it is not easy to locate the Mongols' own voice, as most of the sources were penned by the subject and neighbors, each bounded in the concept and premises of his own civilization. Yet, by using Mongolian sources, such as the Secret History of the Mongol, the only indigenous literary source for the rise of Genghis Khan, together with Mongol letters, inscriptions, and seals on coins, and notably by comparing sources from different parts of the empire, as well as looking at the Mongol actions, hopefully the Mongol indigenous concept can be traced. But we'll start with the universalism part, or the universal part. So Mongol extension began as a combination of both practical and ideological factors, but ideology played a major role in the shaping of Mongol spatial conquest. As it is well known, the root of the heart of this ideology was the heaven-ordained mandate that gave the Mongols the right to rule upon earth. Now, the notion of the heavenly mandate originated in earlier steppe empire, notably the Turkic empires of the 6th to 8th century, and obviously brings to mind the Chinese mandate of heaven. However, there were quite a few differences between the steppe mandate, which the Mongols adopted and developed, and its Chinese counterpart. Like in the older steppe empire, and unlike the Chinese mandate, in the Mongol case, Tangri, the supreme sky god, conferred the right to rule over earth and the heavenly charisma, Su, to a single clan. Each of its members, but only they, could theoretically be elevated to the supreme rulership, namely to the post of the Khan, or Great Khan. Among the clan members, however, the main criteria for selecting a future Khan was a demonstration of his charisma, or good fortune, namely his skill, intelligence, and fortune on the battlefield and outside it. Practically, this means that succession struggles were endemic, and moreover, that the empire was conceived as a joint property of the entire royal clan, and the Khan was therefore expected to share its wealth and territory with his kin. These redistributions, in turn, contributed both to the dissolution of the empire into various polities and to the ongoing connections among these successor states. Moreover, unlike the Chinese case, Tengri did not bestow his mandate on every generation. So the steppe world was often left without a unifying ruler, sometimes for centuries. And yet the notion of the mandate remained as an ideology in reserve, even during periods of disunion, ready to be revived if the creation of a super-tribal empire were to be attempted again. The aspirant Khan therefore had to prove that he had received the mandate by displaying the charisma required to hold it, mainly on the battlefield. Now, the possession of the mandate was also conferred by shamanic ceremonies and reinforced by the rules control of sacred territories, and I will return to this issue below. However, the most important criteria for demonstrating the possession of both the mandate and the charisma was concrete success on the battlefield. This meant that the Mongols had to wage war not only for practical reasons, like keeping the military busy and united or receiving booty for redistribution, but also for ideological ones, to prove their legitimacy. So in 1206, when Temujin was enthralled to Genghis Khan, his mandate was limited to the people of the Feldwald Tents, namely to the steppe people, and the polity was called the Mongol Ulus, the Mongol nation or the Mongol state. In 1211, or perhaps later, but I think that in 1211, the name was changed to the Great Nation of the Mongol, Yeke Mongol Ulus, which was the name that the Mongol used afterwards to denounce their empire. And this was after several non-Mongol entities joined Genghis Khan enterprise, like he has his first victory against the Jurchen and Jin, and the Uyghurs already joined in, and also the Karluks. And so we have the Great Nation of the Mongols. Later on, and because of the spate of Genghis Khan victories, and notably the invasion to Central Asia in 1219 and 1225, the mandate became much larger. It was not only confined to the steppe, it actually encompassed both steppe and zone. And this was quite a new one, and the Mongols took it very seriously. This change is made clear by the edict ascribed to Genghis Khan. You say, this is the order of the everlasting God. In heaven, there's only one eternal God. On earth, there is only one Lord, Genghis Khan. The same idea permeates the title, seals, and letter of Genghis Khan's heir. So Ogode, Genghis Khan's son and heir, is called Dalai Khan, or the Oceanic or Universal Khan, which is glossed in Chinese as Khanei Huangdi, the emperor of all within the seas. And the same title appeared also on the seal of Ogode's son and heir, Guyuk. Now, the Mongol universal ideology in its third Mongolian form, Monke Tangrin Kuchundur Kaanu Sudur, namely by the might of the eternal heaven, by the good fortune or charisma of the Khan, appeared at the head of their letters, edict, and seal. It was often translated to various other languages and embellished with Quranic verses, reference from Confucian classes, or even biblical quotes, according to the prospective audience. Now, my favorite is actually this letter that Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulegu, sent to Louis IX, the King of France, in 1262. I think it illustrates nicely how this universal or full-fledged universal claim sounded like. In this letter, Hulegu quotes the Mongol shaman Tengri, which allegedly enthroned Genghis Khan using the words of the prophet Jeremiah, of all people. And he said, and I read, I alone am the Almighty God on high, and I have set you over the nations and over the kingdom to be king of all the world, to root and to pull down, and to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. So this last sentence is taken from the Bible, from the first chapter of Jeremiah, and you have here the Hebrew original. But make a point that my point is here, not only that he is king of the whole world, but that the Mongol came not only to destroy and throw down, but also to build and to plant. And then he continues, I tell you to announce my command to all the nations, tongues, and tribes of the east, the south, the north, and the west, to promulgate it in all the region of the whole world, where emperors, king, and sovereign rule, where lordship operate, where horses can go, ships sail, envoy reach, letter be heard, so that those who have ears can hear, those who hear can understand, and those who understand can believe. So I think this beautiful letter represents the scope of the broad and heavenly mandate. The mandate encompassed everything, including the maritime world. You see, you have here the ship sails. So the maritime world is already included. And in terms of space, it means that the Mongols divided the world into two parts. First, the one that they already conquered, and second, the part that still need to be subjugated. So this is reminiscent of the Muslim context of the Abud of Islam and the Abud of war, or the Chinese concept of all under heaven, in which the expansion is expected to come not by military power, but through the recognition of the moral superiority of the Chinese emperor. Unlike those concepts, however, the Mongols defined the division not in territorial terms, but in terms of people, just as the wealth of a nomadic chief is measured not in territory, quite abundant in the steppe, but in manpower, a much scarcer resource. The Mongol differentiation between people who were pacified or submissive in Mongolian Ilirgen and those who were rebellious, Bulra Irgen, who would eventually be pacified. So the rebellion of the latter was not directed only against Mongol authority, but also against heaven that enabled that authority, and was therefore futile and punishable, as the Mongols explained in the ultimatums that they sent to various rulers. However, despite the stress on people, Mongol success also have territorial dimensions. The Mongols' popular phrase for describing the universalistic dimension of the empire was that they rule from the site of the rising sun in the east to the site of the sunset in the west, namely from east to west. And this idiom, first used in the letter Guyu Ka'an sent to the Pope in 1246, if not earlier, was repeated in a variety of Mongolian, Muslim, and Chinese sources for describing the empire's realm, both throughout the expansion and after it stopped, when the empire's sheer size was sufficient proof of its legitimation. Another implication of this universalistic concept was that the Mongols hardly differentiated between external and internal territories and policies, since every state that was not yet taken was a potential conquest target. This universal worldview took the world conquest mission rather literally, and resulted in a foreign policy that saw expansion by military power as its main aim. The Mongols were willing to accept peaceful submission, but they were not ready to forge any foreign relations based on equality or commit to any sustainable alliances with other polities. They also took great pains to eliminate competing rulers with universal claims, such as the Abbasid caliphs or the Jin and Sung emperor. In addition, they refuted calls for conversion to either Christianity or Islam by explaining that heaven was obviously with them already, as proved by their continued military success. Now we must remember that this huge empire, called the United Empire, was divided internally, both due to the principle of redistribution, the Mongol concept of redistribution of lands and people among the family member, and by various administrative divisions. But still, the main way in which the Mongols conceived the empire by this stage is really from the site of the rising sun in the east to the site of the sunset in the west. I mean, very, very universal concept, and literally going to conquer the whole world. Now, the original mandate was also enforced by controlling sacred territories, which were considered repositories of charisma. Such a territory was the Ottoman Mountains near the Orkhon River in central Mongolia, which was celebrated in the Turkic Orkhon River, which was celebrated in the Turkic Orkhon inscription of the 8th century, in which the Turk successor, the Uyghurs, later built their capital, Kharbalgas. The Mongol capital, Karakorum, was also established in this region in the 1230s, and we have both Chinese and Muslim sources attesting that before choosing its location, the Mongols actually sought the remains of former nomadic empires. Excavating stele and checking Chinese history books, the Mongols looked for both historical and archaeological evidence, as well as folk memories, making the most of them to enhance the charismatic location of the capital. Karakorum, however, was established a few dozen kilometers from the Turkic Uyghur site. So here is Karakorum, and This is the Turkic side, and this is the Uyghur side. It was established between the two tributaries in a point on the trade routes of Mongolia, in a place or point allegedly chosen by Genghis Khan himself. And this made it possible both to enjoy the region's repositories of charisma while stressing the uniqueness of the Genghisid experience. In 1260, however, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson and the Mongols' new great Khan, transferred the Mongol capital from Karakorum to North China, eventually to Beijing. Now, this can easily be explained in strategic, political, economic, and now even climatic consideration. But what about the charisma? This entailed the renunciation of Karakorum's repositories of charisma. By the 1260, however, the charisma was so deeply embedded in the Genghisid family by then ruling territories much vaster than the steppe, that such a conception was not a problem. This shift meant, however, that the empire center moved from the steppe to the sedentary realm, and that Mongolia, the original heart of the empire, was gradually marginalized into a periphery. Now, Kublai's shift of the capital to North China in 1260 also signaled the dissolution of the United Mongol Empire. This process originated in succession struggle, the empire's sheer size, Genghis Khan's allocation of specific uluses to his son and brothers during his lifetime, and the fact that the empire now had already reached the steppe's ecological border. The ensuing dissolution led to the eventual consolidation of 4 interconnected polities centering China, Iran, Central Asia, and the Mongol region. However, while each of these polities voiced universal claims and appropriated Genghisid achievement, they also adopted various local elements from the subject, trying to carve out their separate identities. So imperial space in this period had several overlapping dimensions, what I call the glocalization. First, all the polities belonged to the Genghisid space, or the Mongol Commonwealth, in which the Khan was eventually acknowledged as nominally superior to the other rulers. Simultaneously, each polity still voiced universal claims, but not necessarily manifesting them by military power. Moreover, each of them adopted also more particular or local space or legitimation construct, often with universal aspiration. The Khanate adopted the world religion, Tibetan Buddhism in China, Islam in the other Khanates, thereby becoming part of the Buddhist or Islamic realms. And at least in China and Iran, where strong local imperial tradition had existed, they were also revived and articulated. Together, this amalgamation created what I called glocal space, combining universal and local elements. Now let's see what does it mean. The 4 emerging Mongol polities were part of a Genghisid space. They still see themselves as brotherly states, part of a common Genghisid space. Despite the various and often bloody disputes among them, they still held to the ideal of a Genghisid unity. And even at the height of the Inter-Mongol conflict in the last decade of the 13th century, the rival Khanates continued to exchange gifts and messengers. They regarded each other in kinship terms, Akka and Ini, big and little brothers, and referred to the conflict as family feuds, which were never intended to eliminate the rivals. In spatial terms, the 4 policies were connected not only by the postal system that stretched throughout the Genghisid realm, but also by the appanage, or in Mongolian kubi, allocated to various Genghisid from the newly conquered regions during the United Empire period that were often located in the territories of a rival ulus. Moreover, they shared other Mongol institutions such as the Keshing, Guard, the Yaruchi, judges, the Darurochi, local governors, and those were applied side by side with local administrative tradition. Now, these 4 states also held to the universalistic claims and to world conquest ideology. But after 1260, world conquest became much more complicated. And not only because the Inter-Mongol conflict prevented the vast mobilization of imperial resources that characterized formal campaigns. These thoughts also often hindered the Khanates from concentrating their efforts on expansion, as they had to defend themselves against a rival ulus. Moreover, because the empire had already reached the ecological border of steppe nomadism on all its border, further expansion demanded organization, warfare technique, and equipment different from the former light cavalry steppe campaign. The Mongol managed to break the ecological border in South China, here, where the gains in terms of both legitimation and economy were by far the greatest. They were less successful in the other fronts. Moreover, even in China, further attempts which took place simultaneously with or after the Song conquest were not very successful in Java or Burma, or completely disasters in Japan. As a consequence, expansion practically came to an end in the 14th century, and the dynamics were not renewed afterwards, even after the four Mongol policies concluded a peace agreement in 1304 or acknowledged Deccan nominal superiority in 1320s. However, the stopping of military expansion did not mean that the Mongol successor states gave up on their universalistic claims. Since all four Khanate were vast polities and, moreover, the empire was perceived as a joint patrimony of the Jinghisid, each state could appropriate the achievement of Genghis Khan and his heir and proudly present them to its local audience for both propaganda against enemies and internal legitimation. In other words, when expansion ceased, the very size of the empire was used as evidence to its continued legitimacy. Now, the continuous adherence to universal space found expression in Mongol commissioned historical, geographical, and cartographical works, which flourished after the dissolution of the empire. One important consequence of the Empire Dimensions and its world conquest ideology, whether you understand it as mission complete or as work in progress, was the huge increase in the knowledge about the world in terms of its geography, history, and its visual representation in cartography. Such information was first collected in order to facilitate further military campaigns, and intelligence gathering continued in the period of the successor states as well. So we find the Mongols collecting or preparing maps of border or due to be conquered regions such as Java, Burma, Yunnan in South China, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. However, the more ambitious Yuan and Ilkhanid works are explained not just by military needs, but as a cultural outcome of the unprecedented dimensions of the empire. So in 1286, Jamal ad-Din, a Muslim astronomer in Kublai's court, who was also responsible for the introduction of the first terrestrial globe to China, asked Kublai to sponsor the production of a unified geographic treatise that would cover all the lands that the Mongol had conquered and would be accompanied by a map. And he said, the entire land of China was very small in the past. The geographic books of the Khitai, Northern Chinese, had only 40 to 50 types. Now, all the lands from the plains of sunrise to sunset has become our territory. And therefore, do we not need a more detailed map? How can we understand distant places? The Islamic maps are at our hands. And therefore, could we combine them, the Chinese maps, to draw a world map? So Kublai approved of Jamal ad-Din's request and ordered the Palace Library to collect geographic gazetteer and maps from every region in the empire in order to compile the Great Treatise. It was completed in 1303, called the Treatise of the Great Unified Reign of the Great Yuan, or Dayuan Itumje, as you see here, and contained 1,300 chapters. Although it had not survived, except for part of its introduction, it must have included extensive description of foreign countries. And this assumption is reinforced by the available map. The most impressive map that originated in the Yuan is the very famous map of integrated regions and terrains of historical countries and capitals that was produced in Korea in 1402, but as shown by Hodon Kim, was based on Yuan maps, most probably on Jamal ad-Din's. Now these maps, it's a map that was made in Korea. So you see that Korea is huge. China is certainly the Middle Kingdom, and the Middle East, Asia, the rest of Asia and Europe and Africa are all squeezed to this side. But still, the map contained more than 100 places in Europe, including Marseille, Sevilla, Barcelona, Paris, and 35 places in Africa. And I guess some of the information was probably taken indeed from Muslim sources. Now, the existing Ilkhanid maps are less impressive, but the major contribution to the Mongol notion of universality belongs to the field of history rather than cartography. And this is the Compendium of Chronicle, or Jamil Tawarikh, the first world history compiled by Ilkhanid historian and Wazir Rashid ad-Din. When Ilkhan Jaitu commissioned the world from Rashid ad-Din, he had famously proclaimed, and again I'm reading, until now, no one at any time has made a history of all inhabitants of the climate of the world and the various classes and groups of humans. There is no book in this realm that informs about all countries and regions, and no one has delved into the history of the ancient kings. In these days, when, thanks God, all corners of the earth are under our control and that of Genghis Khan's illustrious family, and philosophers, astronomers, scholars, and historians of all religions and nations, Katai, North China, Machin, South China, India, Kashmir, Tibet, Uyghur, and other nations of Turks, Arabs, and Franks are gathered in droves at our glorious court. Each and every one of them are well informed on some of them. It is our considered opinion that of those detailed histories and stories, a compendium that would be perfect should be made in our royal names. So Rashid-Din book was supposed also to include a geographical volume and a map, but neither has survived and perhaps they were never compiled. And yet, Rashid-Din world history, which included, apart from that of the Mongol, the history of the Chinese, the Indians, the Muslims, the Jews, the Turks, and the Franks, contained a huge amount of geographical information, notably on Mongolia and East Asia. Now, in Ujjaitu's world, in the Ilkhanate, just as in Jamal ad-Din address to Kublai, it is the space that creates knowledge. It is because we, the Mongols, now rule the world that we want to know more about it. Interestingly, both history and map included also regions and people that are not incorporated into the Jinggisid space, namely that were not politically ruled by the Mongols. But here too, Ujjaitu's words can be suggestive. In his commissions, Ujjaitu did not differentiate between people and territories conquered by the Mongols and those that were not, claiming instead that the whole world is under Genghis Khan family. Apparently, the flocking of these non-conquered people, Indians, Franks, namely Europeans, Arabs, to his court was taken as their recognition of Jinggisid superiority, in a way quite similar to the Chinese concept of tribute. By then, by the late 14th century, or by the early 14th century, the great Khan in Beijing also has to satisfy himself with formal acknowledgement of his superiority from various kingdoms in South and Southeast Asia. The terminology was still one of submission, and the original demand of the tributaries were similar to those made by the submitted rulers, such as sending people either as hostage or gift to the Yuan court. But practically, the Mongols were content with the participation of external rulers in the imperial economic system. In other words, the Mongols no longer used military power as their main means of world conquest. Instead, they turned to soft power methods, namely using their economic and cultural prestige to maintain the image of universal superiority. Indeed, after the conquest of South China with its lively port, the Mongols combined the maritime and continental routes of the Old World into one integral global system, far larger than the imperial realms. Now, this is a drawing that I made a few years ago, and it deeply needs to be updated, but I think it makes clear that, that the space much farther than the empire was connected by the various trade routes that connected the empire, be they European, Muslims, Chinese, Indian, Hindu, or Buddhist, and each of them has both maritime and continental aspects. I mean, the maritime and the continental were closely connected. So participants in this integrated system could be seen as the new Il-Irgen, or submitted people, who were taking part in the extensive commercial and cultural contract across the continent. Universal rulership was expressed in competition for attracting traders, experts, and diplomats from all under heaven to the Mongol courts. Indeed, the huge population movement which the Mongols initiated and encouraged of soldiers, administrative diplomats, merchants, missionaries, adventurers, and experts of various kinds within the empire borders and farther afield, promoted scientific and cultural exchange throughout Eurasia and broadened the horizon of the Mongol contemporaries. However, while each of the Mongol successor states voiced universal claim and appropriated the Jinggisid achievements, they also adopted a variety of local elements and legitimate in concept. This was perhaps the legitimate value of soft power was weaker than that of military expansion, while at the same time, the different policies were trying to carve their separate identity within the Jinggisid rule. Moreover, the empire's dissolution also resulted in closer connection between the Mongols and the subject in each polity, due to both practical consideration, such as gaining legitimacy, co-opting local elite, or ruling more effectively, and due to gradual assimilation of the tiny Mongol elite in the huge native population. One of the clearest manifestations of this was the Mongols' embracing of universal world religion, Tibetan Buddhism in China, Islam in all the other Mongol Khanate, which make them part of the Buddhist or Islamic realms, respectively. Another main difference, and more relevant for our talk, is the adoption of earlier imperial concepts where such concepts existed, namely in China and Iran. Now, in a typical nomadic amalgamation, again, the various legitimation and spatial concepts, Chinese, Jingjisid, religious, local, Chinese or Iranian, coexisted and were not mutually exclusive. Now, in China, the revival of the local imperial concept meant the restoration of the Confucian ideal of the great unity, or Tai Tong, namely the unification of the Sinitic world under one ruler. This idea had a very long history, but was rather downplayed in the more than 300 years prior to the Yuan, when China was divided among two sons of heaven, the northern one and the southern one. In Iran, the idea of Iran Zamin, the land of Iran, namely Iran as a political unit, in Iran, the idea of Iran Zamin, or literally the land of Iran, namely Iran as a political unit independent of the rest of the Muslim world, was revived for the first time since the fall of the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century. Now, this concept fitted quite nicely with the borders of the respective successor state. The territory directly under the Ka'an rules, what we call the Yuan Dynasty, included after the conquest of the Sung after 1279, both northern and southern China, unified by the Mongol after more than 350 years of division. But it also included much broader territories such as Mongolia, Manchuria, Tibet, Yunnan, Korea, could only add to the Mongols' legitimacy. Likewise, the Ilkhanate territory was reminiscent of the realm of Sassanid Iran, the last indigenous dynasty before the Arab conquest. In both cases, embracing the local imperial vocabulary was quite easy for the Mongols, as both Chinese and Iranian empires, in both Chinese and Iranian imperial concept included a strong universal component, an ideological element similar to the Mongol one. Now, the Mongol of heaven in China, and the notion of charisma, in Persian far or farnach, in Iran. Moreover, as highly pragmatic rulers, the Mongols might have realized the advantages of utilizing local imperial ideology as a means for co-opting local elites. The initiative probably came from the Mongols' local advisor, who strove to accommodate their foreign lords into the local tradition, thereby legitimizing the service of the alien rulers. Now, most of the local elite under Mongol rule saw the space in its particular and regional context, not in its more universal realm. And see, for example, what Song Lian, the would-be compiler of the Yuan official history, the Yuanshe, under the succeeding Ming Dynasty, a man who refused to serve the Yuan, but certainly acknowledged its mandate. In introduction to a collection of biographies he compiled in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, Song says, "Our August Yuan received the bright mandate from heaven to bring peace to the Sinitic world. Where the heavenly lands pointed, the myriad directions all followed. At the first round, the many Mongolian tribes came on board. At the second round, the Tangutsia people sued for peace. At the third round, the Jewish and Imperial Wenyan clan submitted. And at the fourth round, the Southern Sung was pacified. The vast realm was unified under one teaching. All were the emperor's servants. With good plans and that judgment, his every action was victorious. As well, he relied upon capable men and unwaveringly loyal officials, and they enabled him to proclaim the power of heaven, and such was the divine speed with which the deeds were performed and governance was established." So obviously for Song Lian, the Yuan achievement was the unification of the Chinese world, because both Jin and Xixia ruled the territories that before the 10th century, the Tang were ruled by Chinese people, just like the Song. He did not refer not even to the other territories included in Yuan China, like the Dali Kingdom that became Yunnan, or Tibet, again Korea, slightly to Mongolia, and he doesn't even mention the other Mongol conquest outside China or outside East Asia. So for him, the important thing was uniting the Chinese world, the Sinitic world, uniting northern and southern China. Something similar was happening in Iran, where my example here appears in the introduction to a chronicle called Nizam el-Tawarikh, or the Screen of Chronicle, a Persian work devoted to the history of Iran from the time of Adam, from the earliest time, to Abaka, Hulegu's sons, and the reigning Ilkhan. It was compiled in 1275, namely 20 years before the Islamization of the Ilkhanate. And the author, Khatib al-Dawi, who was a judge and a notable Muslim scholar, famous for his Quranic commentary, wrote, I have collected this book from reliable chronicles and named it Nizam el-Tawarikh, the arrangement of chronicles. For in it I have connected the sequence of governance of kings of Iran, which extend from the Euphrates to the Oxus, or rather from the Arab lands to the borders of Khojand, as will be mentioned, from Adam, peace be upon him, to the present day, which is 17 July 1275. Now, the Mongols appears the 8th group of the book, the last in a section devoted to the Iranian kingdoms, the independent Iranian kingdoms. And he says, the 8th group is the Mongols, whose leaders and chief is Genghis Khan. He attacked the Khawarizm in 1220. He and his son governed many lands of the Khatta, the Chinese, and Turks. They conquered the whole of Iran and subjugated its kingdoms and kings. Of his son, Hulegh Khan was the first who ruled Iran and conquered its territories. His son Abaka is king of Iran Zamin, the Iranian lands, Rum, which is Anatolia, Iraq, and all the Iranian kingdoms. He is strongly inclined toward justice and compassion and favors the Muslim entirely. So, while Bagdawi was quite aware of the Ilkhanid Genghis connections and the rule in other places, his focus was on the rule in Iran, which is defined as stretching from the Euphrates to the Oxus, again excluding even parts of Anatolia that were part of the Ilkhanid realm. So his focus is again on this, well, quite big, but still limited Iranian space. Now, did the Mongols also see their space in these terms? Not necessarily. Now, the most striking example of the different concept is the lack of the Mongolian word for China. So the Mongols continued to use Khitai for North China and Manzi for South China, and so did their employees like Marco Polo that you're reading, or Rashid-ad-Din. For the Mongols, however, we have several Sino-Mongolian inscriptions that made clear that for the Mongols, Yuan, as the dynasty was known in China, equals the Yeke Mongol Ulus, namely the United Mongol Empire or the whole Genghis space. So for the Ka'an, he saw himself reigning over the whole Genghis realm. So for the Mongols, from Korea to Hungary, at least nominally, and for the Mongols, the great unification, the Dai Tong, refers not only to China, but to the entire Genghis space. What about the Ilkhans in Iran? Well, they built the first palace in Iranian lands on the site of a former Sasanian site known as Takht Suleiman, the throne of Solomon, which means it also has a biblical and Islamic connotation. They also invested lavish sum in patronizing the productions of beautifully illustrated manuscript of the Persian epos, the Shahnameh, Book of Kings, portraying its hero and kids in Mongol garbs. And you have here, this is example of Alexander the Great Iron Riders attacking India. But Alexander the Great was considered also a Persian king, and he was very, very famous and popular among the Mongols because he was also an outsider conqueror who became a world conqueror and became also a famous Persian king and the establisher of a dynasty. But you can see here, the riders of Alexander are dressed in Mongol clothes, and they're driving in a very Chinese-like landscape, all these clouds. So on the other hand, it's a very Persian thing. On the other hand, it has certainly a global connotations. And indeed, if you look not on the Shahnameh or the sites, if you look at the other mediums like the Ilkhanid letters, called inscription, those hardly mention the name Iran or purely Iranian titles like King of Kings, the Shahanshah. Instead, they highlight the Genghis ideology of world conquest, which is very much present in these genres. Remember the Hulegu's letter that we started with, and it's available well into the 14th century. It remained valid even after the Ilkhanate Islamization in 1295, when Islamic formulas were added. So apparently the Mongols felt more at home with the universal word of Islam and Genghis, And of course, they can claim the leadership of Islam after they had eliminated the caliphate. So this was more, it spoke to them more than the more limited notion of Iran. Or in other words, while adopting a more complex or local spatial concept favored by the subject, the Mongols still stress the universal aspect of this concept. And now for the last part, and shorter, how did the Mongol affected future imperial space? Actually, it was the Glocal world and its concept that had the biggest impact of the shaping of future Eurasian space. In geopolitical terms, United China, independent Iran, and Russia as a Eurasian superpower are still with us, as is the dominance of Beijing and Moscow. In Central Asia, in contrast, the Mongol period's main effect was a major ethnic reconfiguration. The population movement generated by the conquest and post-conquest policies led to the disappearance of various established steppe people, such as the Khitans, the Uyghur, the Tanguts, the Kipchaks, and the emergence of new collectivities, such as the Muslim people of the Nogais, Tatars, Kazakhs, and Uzbeks, which became the modern Central Asiatic, the modern Central Asian people. However, the term Mongolia and Mongolistan, Mongolia over here and Mongolistan, the Eastern Chagatai realm, which is the equivalent to today's Xinjiang and Kyrgyzstan and parts of South Kazakhstan, can be considered a central spatial legacy of the Mongol Empire in the inner Asian realm. Moreover, the Mongols left to their followers a host of imperial institutions that continue to be used across Eurasia, contributing not only to the Mongols' direct successor states, but also to other regional empires. In fact, one of the many aspects of the Mongol impact was the reinvigoration of empire building across Eurasia. And again, the new continental empires that emerged between the 14th and the 17th century were all indebted to the Mongols, even though this debt was not always readily acknowledged. Now, those post-Mongol empires include Russia, of course, over here, and the Ming China, and later the Manchu Qing, the Islamic empires of the Timurids, and later the Safavids, and the Ottomans, and the Mongols in India. And most of these, and the Mongols in India, and most of these empires were more enduring and vaster than the pre-Mongol empire. Surprisingly, the weakest post-Mongol empires were those established in the steppe regions, particularly in Mongolia itself. And you can see there's no empire in Mongolia in the 16th and 17th century. Because in Mongolia, the Genghis charisma was not enough to overcome either the steppe centrifugal forces or the rivalry of the post-Mongol sedentary empire. Moreover, the dissolution of the steppe between Islam and Tibetan Buddhism, notably after the Mongols' second conversion in the 16th century, prevented the whole steppe unification under the standard of Tangri. Ironically, the post-nomadic empires that built on the Mongol experience, while combining it with the rich resources and improved technology of the sedentary population, Russia, Imperial Russia, and the Qing China, succeeded in eventually subjugating the descendant of Genghis Khan, dividing the steppe among them from the 18th century. Now, part of the success of these post-nomadic empires was certainly connected to the fact that Russia can hug the steppe from the north. Before the Mongol period, this north was no man's land, and the steppe people could run away to it when they need to seek refuge, for example, from the Chinese. However, in the post-Mongol period, the north, now represented by Russia, was held by a very strong imperial force, and together Russia and China can switch the nomads between them. So it was actually the success of the Mongol nomadic order that brought about the decline of the steppe world of the nomadic order that gave the rise to Genghis Khan. However, Mongol legacy was not limited to the continental empire. As Samuel Edsel eloquently argued, if Europe came to dominate the world, it was because Europe first perceived there was a world to dominate. Now, and this knowledge about the world, this is what the Mongols gave to Europe. And in this case, the works of people like Marco Polo, of course, and his predecessor, John of Brano Carpini, William of Rubruck, and other travelers made, of course, a real difference. And so when Columbus set out on his first voyage in 1492, his principal objective was to find the land of the great Khan that emerged from the book of Marco Polo, whom he ardently admired. And thus, the Mongol imperial enterprise even promoted the discovery of the New World. In conclusion, and I'd like to conclude on a nice background, the Mongol spatial concept evolved with the empire. They began with a universal heavenly ordained mandate to rule over the earth, which led to an unprecedented territorial expansion by military power. This expansion both attested to the holding of the mandate and brought about its broadening to include the whole world, in actually the most universalistic version of the mandate ever. In the long run, it also accelerated the empire's dissolution. In the interconnected post-1260 Mongol world, the universal concept was replaced or at least supplemented with a local concept, which combined universal aspiration with local elements and legitimation concept. Under this local world order, military power was gradually replaced by economic and cultural prestige, namely soft power, as the main channels of claiming universal leadership, while world religions and local pre-Mongol imperial concept played a larger role and affected the various Mongol government. It was this composite global phase that had a tremendous impact on the reshaping of the future imperial space, both regionally, in China, Iran, Russia, and the steppe, and across the Muslim world, and globally, not least by facilitating the discovery of the New World. And thank you very much. That's all. Oops.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. I'll ask students and others to type in their question. I see some of them are coming in. I myself had a number of questions because of this fascinating lecture, and the final part, the legacy part, I think can be a bit controversial. If we have time, we can come back to it. But I wanted to ask you, since you are an expert on the Chagatai, the Mongols in Central Asia. So usually when we do the Mongol history, we look at the Chinese sources, we look at the Persian sources, and then your notion of space and understanding of the space, the knowledge of space, was also based on Chinese and Persian sources and their views. So since you are an expert on the Chagatai in Central Asia, how did they consider the Mongol space? Right? I mean, they were at some point, Kaitu in particular, fighting Kublai Khan. And so for him, or for the Chagatai in general, where do they fit in? How did they perhaps saw the space that perhaps Kublai Khan and Ilkhanate saw differently?
Well, thank you very much for this question, which gave me the opportunity to speak about the Chagatais. But in the case of the Chagatai, there was no strong imperial concept. I mean, there's nothing like the Iranian tradition or the Chinese tradition in Central Asia. Yes, there were the Karachitai, another one of my favorite people, but they were ephemeral. There was no strong unified emperor apart from the Mongols, of course. And therefore, when the Chagatai had to define their state, they used a Mongol term, and they called themselves the Dumadu Mongol Ulus, the Middle Mongolian Ulus, the Middle Mongolian kingdoms. And this refers mainly to their location in the middle of the Mongol imperial space, you know, with China and the Iran and the Golden Horde all around the Chagatais, and also with a wink perhaps to the concept of the Middle Kingdom, which was the most important thing. And moreover, this use of the the Middle Mongolian Ulus, or the Middle Mongolian state, has another advantage in case of the Chagatais, because one of the problems of the Chagatais was that, or the Central Asian Mongols, was the two competed Uluses were located in Central Asia, the Ogotais, represented later by Kaidu, and the Chagatais. So it was very hard for them to choose one of them, but by calling themselves the Middle Mongolian Ulus, that was fine. That refers to both Ogodai and Chagatais and give them a place of honor in the middle of the empire. So I think that's how they managed to find a solution to how do they define themselves into this divided Mongol Jingisi space.
That's really fascinating. also something related not to China and Persia in such a way, but to Tibet. One of the first questions is about, did this concept of imperial space also facilitate the Tibetans going back to their knowledge of imperial space? You know, in the 7th, 8th century, they were an imperial power as well. And the question is, did the Ulus itself create a notion of this local versus global imperial space, particularly with regard to the Tibetans, but more generally as well? I think you are getting to that in the later part of saying that how this notion of imperial space had a legacy. Can you explain that local and global aspect of imperial space?
Yeah, I think like everything Mongols, they used the more the merrier. So if at first in the United Empire, they will just have this universal concept, we have the mandate, we are going to rule the world. If we didn't continue now, we will continue tomorrow, and so on. When the empire was dissolved, each part of it has to, to crave his own place into this huge Genghis space. So of course they used also the universal aspects, because the Genghis was the dimension of the empire was a great legitimation factors, and it was important to them, but they also used whatever they have in the local regions. And of course, it was easier in China and Iran when they have such a well-established imperial concept. As for Tibet and they use it together. So you have both this Genghis, the global universal part, and the more local, which is also quite universal. Usually you think about the Chinese empire as quite universal, and also about the Iranian universal, but it's a smaller universal than the huge Mongol one. And they also use the Tibetan Buddhist and the Islamic part. And I think for Tibet, it was much more useful for the Tibetans to go for the Tibetan Buddhism card than to the older Tibetan empire. First of all, because there was no Tibetan empire for quite a few centuries. And secondly, because now the realm in the Mongol world was dependent on the leadership of the Tibetan Buddhists. So I think, and of course the emperors in China adhere to the Tibetan Buddhists. So this was a better card to play than the memory of Tibet. If you want, the memory of Tibet was very local, but but Tibetan Buddhism, this was universal. So it was local, but I mean, both local and universal, and therefore the Mongols like it much better, and therefore the Tibetans use it in rather nicely and rather successfully as to creating their own version of imperial states in Buddhist terms.
Right. Daniel, if I didn't ask your question correctly, then please rewrite the question. The next question is from one of our students. They, of course, read that article if Taiyuan was a Chinese dynasty or not by Professor Kim. And so they are asking you what you think about Taiyuan. Is it a Chinese dynasty or not? And what role does conquest really play? I mean, you mentioned that it shifts to economic and trade relations as part of universalism, replacing perhaps conquest. Was that a decision that was formally made, or it was made within one of the khanates, and it was not a universal decision that no more expansion? So is Taiyuan a Chinese dynasty to start with, and then the expansion?
I think like nearly everything in the Mongol sphere, Taiyuan is both a Chinese dynasty and or certainly not a typical Chinese dynasty. Again, it was obviously the Chinese, as I said, understand it as the Chinese dynasty, but the Mongols, for them, even though they used this concept of China, of uniting China and so on, and they benefit from the subject enthusiasm about this, for them, Taiyuan was the whole Genghis space, from Russia and Hungary to Korea. But again, this was in the level of proclamation, not in the practical level. You know, what is interesting is that we have a 14th century Mamluk scholar from Egypt who lived in the 14th century, and he understands this because he says that there's a big Genghis space, he called it the Mongol Empire, the Mongol world, and he said he divided to Iran, the Ilkhanate, Turan, which is both the Joshij and the Chagatai, and China, which is, he said it's the land of the Great Khan, but he said that the Great Khan is like the Caliph for the Muslims. Like the Caliph was for the Muslims, so is the Great Khan for all the Mongol regions. So all the Mongol states, whether in Iran or in Turan, the Ilkhans, the Joshi, the Chagatai, they all thought about the Great Khan in China as their overall ruler. And I think this is something that the Mongols really liked, and Mongols in China try to make known, and at least in Iran, until the late 13th century, they also accepted it and were quite happy with it. But in the Chagatai and the Golden Horde, it took them a long time to get into this, and only after the Yuan authority was practically nominal and not really practical. So for the Mongols, the Yuan was also, I mean, the Yuan was a Chinese dynasty, but it was much more. It was a bigger a dynasty that ruled not only over China, but also over other regions. Although even them, if you look at the Yuan maps, not the one I showed, but another famous map, they recognize that there are borders between the different Mongol states, as well as between the Mongol space and the other region of the world, but they still broadcast their nominal superiority as the Great Khan of all this Genghis space. Now, as for expansion and whether it was a decision to stop expansion and to move into soft power, I don't think it was ever an expansion that really taken place in all the Mongol realms, but it simply was a practical thing. I mean, in China, you can see it in Timur Jaitu, who inherited Kublai. He stopped first of all, he stopped the expansion to South and Southeast Asia. He said, too much money, too waste of money. Let's stop it. Then he tried to, he tried to reconcile with the Chagatai and Ogodays, or actually he beat them and then they reconciled after Kaito's death. And then he made peace in this realm as well, because he recognized that if you want, the Yuan realm is big enough and it will be much, much harder to expand further. And if he can, he can satisfy himself with asking for formal superiority, just like the Chinese did throughout the years. In this respect, the Yuan was certainly a Chinese dynasty, the Yuan, because, okay, we are the superiors, but if we cannot have a real superior, we can have formal superiors. So all these people can bring tribute and say that how big we are, and this will be enough. And they will come to us and give us money and trade in our land. And okay, let's face it, that will be enough. So I think it wasn't like something that they decided because they wanted to stop the military campaigns, but they simply understood that the world had changed. It's now different. So we are no longer able to move people around from one edge of Asia to the other hand. And again, if we look at Iran, they tried to fight the Mamluks for decades, but eventually they understand that, okay, we cannot win them. Why waste so much money? And we are both Muslim. Why not? Let's make peace. And still, eventually, not long ago, after this peace, the Ilkhanate collapsed. So maybe this, this Genghis ideology of world conquest has its role in keeping this polity together. But anyhow, even when they continue this war against the Mamluks, they also already understand that they cannot win it so much. So if they want to broadcast their superiority or their prestige, they have to go to other channels, such as the people coming to the courts and the economic or cultural prestige of the court, which was enormous.
So the other two sets, it's a set of questions that two people have asked with regard to diplomacy, diplomatic connections among the various political units in the Mongol Khanates. So what kind of relationship was there? And I know many people have written about it, but did the knowledge about imperial space or having these kinds of connections spread between the Khanates through diplomatic means during the long 13th, 14th centuries?
Yes, the Khanates continue, even during the 13th century, when they were fighting each other quite badly, they continued to exchange messengers and envoys, both among the Genghis state and outside it. and they had a full diplomatic service. I mean, they have people who were specifically trained as diplomats because they knew many languages or because they have any personal connection to, for example, the people of the Golden Horde or the people of the Chagatai or Ogodei. And then they used to send these people to the specific place because they can be better diplomats because there's a big chance that the other side will greet them more nicely. So this was, so, I mean, there are both inter-Mongol diplomacy and outer-Mongol diplomacy. And actually, many of what we know, especially about the Chagatais, for example, comes from those outer diplomacy, from messengers of the Pope, or from mainly from the Pope, actually, or from the Mamluk states that come or report on the embassies coming to the Chagatais or coming from the Chagatais, and they leave us some description of the realms in which they visited and how they called them. And that's why we know about this Middle Mongolian kingdom, which called the Medium Imperium in Latin, and called the Rosita Telak, the middle part of the necklace in Arabic. So we have this various concepts coming also through diplomacy. And of course, we have, you know, if you read Marco Polo, we have a very detailed description of travelogues. Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, and all the other people who actually describe what they see in the terms that usually in the terms that the Mongols use, because they were acting under Mongol rule. So again, Marco Polo used Kitai and Manzi. He never said China. He has Kitai, Manzi, and Karajang for Yunnan, you know. So he looks at united China as a conglomerate of various states, various provinces, perhaps, under the Great Khan. And the same is true for Shiddedin when he described China, and he has a very long description of China. So I think that the people acting under, I mean, the diplomats, the travelers acting under Mongol rule, they adapted the concept of the rulers, of the Mongols, and not necessarily the concept of the local elites, of the Chinese or Persian in each country. And this makes sense because these people, you know, come in contact mainly with the Mongols.
So sort of connected to that, one of the students is asking, what about the subjects under the Mongol rule? Did they identify with this issue of universalism or localism? And Rashid al-Din, as you see, as a subject, has this global idea, but Sung Lian, who later on writes the Yuan, does not seem to have that universalism idea. So, but they are intellectuals, but common people, how aware, because there's a lot of traveling going on, merchants and traders. So how aware they were with regard to this? I mean, Marco Polo, you mentioned, seems to have that notion, but other people living in China or in Ilkhanate aware of this universalism, Mongol universalism, or the difference between localism and universalism?
I think in this respect, there's a big difference between the China and Iran, or China and the Muslim world in general. Because in China, indeed, Sung Lian is and the Yuansha are representative examples. The Yuansha hardly mention all the other Khanates, and you can never, if you read only the Yuansha, you cannot understand that we have a huge Jingishin space. It's not important. This has to do also with Ming propaganda afterwards. But still, it's impressive, and Song Lian represent this view even before he became a Ming official. Because I think that for the Chinese, if you read the Chinese Wenju, that some of them were aware of the global Mongols, like people who served in the court, like Zhao Mingfu and other people. But even for them, the most important thing was that North China and South China were united. And besides, the Chinese, after all, they benefit very much from the Mongol rule and all this cosmopolitanism and so on, but they were also suspicious. For them, again, there were too many foreigners coming to China, or at least for some of them. It was, I mean, the universalistic aspect was not necessarily too positive. For them, the most positive aspect was this unification of Northern and Southern China. The other people were less interesting in a way. And moreover, the Chinese were much less mobile in this period. Of course, there were merchants and diplomats and so on, but many of them were non-Chinese. Many of them were Mongols or Muslims or whatever. And historians, I don't know, Onguts, whatever. In the Muslim world in general, the Ilkhanate in particular, people were more mobile, and maybe they have, you know, more incentives to come to China, which was the center of the world in terms of the land of the Great Khan and in terms of wealth and culture and everything. So there was a much bigger awareness of this huge Genghis realm and so on. Perhaps also, again, because of the legitimizing needs of the Ilkhanate. Because you see, China was the great Khanate. It doesn't need anything from outside. But the Ilkhanate, part of its legitimation was built on its connection to China, because Ilkhan, as you all know, is the submissive Khan, the one who obeys to the Khan, the great Khan in China. So they have to stress, to emphasize this connection to China and to the broader Genghis realm, because this was their legitimation after all.
Yeah.
This was the only legitimation Hulegu has, and even afterwards when they have Ilkhanid and they built on this Iranian legitimation, it wasn't as strong as for the people in China, where yes, we are the great Khan and we received the mandate, we made the Dai Tong and we are legitimate, you cannot deny it. So I think this difference, and the fact that the people in Iran were much more mobile, in the Muslim world in general, were much more mobile than in China, made this difference that, you know, the Muslim world, or Iran especially, was much more cosmopolitan than Yuan China this state, if you look at the local people, at the subject.
Okay.
I mean, okay.
No. That's I think very, very important to see the difference. That changes, I think, during the Yuan Dynasty. The Chinese become more mobile with the with the various kinds of records being compiled by Chinese merchants, right? So you have some of the records about merchants traveling from the Yuan Dynasty. Tao Yi Chilui, for example, is one of the first writings that is about Chinese traveling to different places under the Mongol world. So that seems to have precipitated the movement of the Chinese, it seems. And they are becoming more like Persians and Arabs. So you see from the Mongol period onwards, you have more traders, Chinese traders settling in the maritime world, for example.
Yeah, of course. But I think relatively speaking, yes, the Chinese became more mobile, but the Iranians became much more mobile because they were more mobile in the beginning. So I think even though the Chinese became more mobile, the Iranians who were who know how to make the best out of the opportunities that the Mongol Emperor suggested in terms of trade or finding a job at the court, so they became even more mobile than the Chinese, and the difference of mobility increased in both places, but still in the Iranian or in the Muslim
part. My question was it an impact of the Mongols that caused the Chinese to become more mobile, knowing that the world they live in, right? I mean, earlier it seems that they were not interested in the maritime world that much, but suddenly in the 13th century, we see them traveling a lot on the maritime world.
Yes, but actually in the Southern Sung, they also traveled a lot. I mean, the Mongols built on what the Southern Sung had established. So, I mean, certainly they made a difference to China, especially by this opening and the coming of all the people. But I think the maritime world was there. I mean, the maritime expertise and the people who actually operated the maritime world were exist in China. But I think the difference that the Mongols made, they combined this maritime expertise with the continental trade routes. And then this made a huge revolution, because it was not only maritime or continental, it was maritime and continental. And then you have much more movement and much more opportunities for trade and for culture and for everything.
So that's the question, that because of all these writings that's appearing and people moving around, knowledge about local areas precipitated this kind of movement, that people came to know about different places through this movement of people and writing of diaries and travelogues that made them aware of the space, right? I mean, there's so much space there. That then again facilitated the movement. As you said, something increased further and other things started. So is this a circulation of knowledge about not only the universal, but the local areas, not only about geography, but also commodities that circulates at this time?
Commodities and languages and knowledge and everything. I mean, it was a process that built itself because there were more movement, and you became to have more travelogues and travel guides and dictionaries for various languages and maps. So, and people can purchase much more knowledge, even if they're sitting in, I don't know, in Italy or in the Crimea or in Korea, they can purchase knowledge about what's going on in other kinds of the world, or even in Europe, of course. And this was a huge difference that it didn't exist before the Mongols. Before the Mongols, the Chinese world was smaller, the European world was certainly much, much smaller, and even the Muslim world, which was the wider, still benefit a lot from this opening to the Mongol period.
So one question, this wider world, I don't remember my Janet Apulugod, but I don't know if she actually argued, this is a question that is being raised, that did the Mongol Empire impact the Renaissance that happened in Italy? The connection, Janet Apulugod wrote about the 13th century world system, but did it anyway have an impact on Renaissance in Italy? That's the question that is being asked. I don't know about it.
I think, okay, it's two different things. Certainly, the Mongol Empire had an impact on Italy because the Italian city-states like Genoa or Venice were the main benefactors, the main European benefactors, the main those who took part in this network of Mongol commercial enterprise. Especially, they connected the Golden Horde with the Mamluks in Egypt and via the Byzantines. Also, they were quite present in the Ilkhanate as well. I mean, there were also for Marco Polo and all the others, individual Italians who go all the way to China, but they did not have this institutional support of the cities, the Genoas or the Venetian infrastructure behind them. But those Italian merchants who were in either the Golden Horde in Kaffa and Tanau or in the Ilkhanate in Tabriz, they have this state and support, and they have a special contract that decided about their rights in the Mongol state. So this was something different and quite unique to this Italian merchant. And of course, we have also the very big cultural influence in Italy. We see it in the painting when you have people wearing this Tatar dress, in various churches, and you have the actual clothes sometimes remaining in those churches, and you have many Tatar slaves, many slaves, Mongol slave Turks, others coming from the Mongol realms into the Italians, and many slave traders coming into the Mongol realms. So there was certainly an impact of the Mongols on Italy. But to make the jump and say that the Mongols bring out the Renaissance, I think it's too much. And believe me, I love the Mongols. I give them great credit, but enough is enough. I mean.
So the other side of that question, another question is, did the others influence the Mongols, especially the Abbasids or the Islamic world in their knowledge about the universalism of what they have conquered? So did they incorporate those knowledge that existed in the places and then had this understanding of space?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Rashid ad-Din history, so he tried when he's doing his history of the Islamic world, he used various well-known works that were written before him, like Ibn al-Asir, or general histories or histories of the Seljuks and the Khawarizm Shah. All these various Muslim writing, they certainly knew about it and they certainly incorporated it and used it. And he was also looking for books from China and from India. It was much harder to find them, but he was still using like Buddhist chronicles for the history of China and perhaps also for India. So they certainly made, like you said, they really collected the books and collected the information and tried to, like we're doing research in a way, try to make what they can do, what they can take out of it and create their own books, and used all these various bits and pieces to create a bigger picture of the world, a real world history. So sometimes there are contradictions between the various parts, and there was probably a whole team that was working on it, not only Rashid ad-Din himself, but still it's an amazing achievement, I think. And if you look at the Mamluk Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, at the same time, they were rivals of the Mongols, but because they were rivals, they were very much interested. And there too, you can find various encyclopedias that are based both on written sources and on oral sources. So, oh, this merchant came from the Ilkhanate and he told us about this and this and this and this, and so on. So there was a big attempt to create this universal work that really encompasses the whole world. In China, it probably, I mean, like what Jamal ad-Din offered was probably about the same, but it didn't survive. And I think it's not a coincidence that it didn't survive, because when the Ming came, I mean, this whole cosmopolitan spirit was much less important. For them, the Chinese part was even more important than it was to the people, to the Chinese people of the Yuan. So this makes
one final, yeah, no, that's really very important. One final question. It's about the last part of your talk about the legacy. And since you pointed out Christopher Columbus, you mentioned, and I personally like that you brought out the soft power part of the Mongol Empire with economic and trading relations. But you also mentioned the Soviet Union, the Qing Empire. One thing that got missing was the European colonization. Would you connect that to the Mongol conquest and expansion? Did the Europeans who conquered Africa and Asia colonized it? So is colonization a word that you would use for the Mongols, which perhaps had a legacy with the Europeans? So that's
well, again, it's a bit like the Renaissance. I mean, as I see it, at least, I mean, the main impact the Mongols had on the European world is that they really they made clear that the world is out there, and it's not just monsters and deserts. It's actually, there's a great wealth somewhere there in the far region, and that's what they gave the European the intensive to go and look for other places. And of course, Columbus wanted to find the lines of a great Khan. He found America, and the rest is history. But again, I think the colonization, it has nothing to do with colonization. If anything, if the Mongols have anything to do with colonization, it's related to the Qing and the Russian. I mean, the continental colonization of those sedentary empires, in which, in a way, they were, at least in the case of the Qing, it's quite obvious that the whole idea of its expansion was to put, after they conquered China, of course, was to put an end to the Mongol danger. Whether it's the Chungas or the Khalkha or whatever, or the Tibet, which was the religious center of the Mongols, they want to finish it. And after they finish it, Qianlong was very happy and said, okay, we are the world, we conquer the world. This is our world. China and the steppe, everything else is not important. Well, Russia maybe, but all those people from the sea, who cares about them? So in a way, this Qing colonization, if I'm allowed to say it, I don't know, at least I see it as colonization of Inner Asia. You can say that this has, and this certainly has a relation to the Mongol period, and the Qing themselves, of course, also appropriated Genghis' legacy and introducing themselves as also as the descendants of Genghis Khan in terms of Tibetan Buddhism, and also as his descendants through marriage and so on. And of course, the Russian also, in their own way, also built on the legacy of the Mongol rule of these vast Eurasian steppes in order to consolidate and legitimate the rule over all these, over most of Genghis' descendants that they incorporated into the world. But again, as for European colonization in Africa, I think the Mongols are not to be blamed for this. Again, enough is enough.
Good. Thank you so much. I personally wanted to ask something about shamanism as the universalist religion or not, and the movement to Tibetan Buddhism. But when I see you in person, I'll talk about religion and where that fits. But I would like to thank you for this wonderful talk and responding to all these questions from students and other members of audience. I hope at some point you can come to Shanghai and give more talks on the Mongols. You are building an institution on the study of Mongols. I think it's a great, and it's very beneficial to my students and others who are studying Mongols. So thank you very much, Professor Biran.
And I hope to come to Shanghai, and you're most welcome to come to Jerusalem whenever we can start going all over the place again.
Yes, I think we should start that exchange at some point. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Have a good evening, Professor.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.